This presentation will be based primarily on these three articles, which I've submitted to the Visualizing Peace library. The aim is to draw out some through lines in the history of Catholic pacifism in the USA over the course of the 20th century. There was no significant Catholic pacifist movement prior to the 20th century. Particular groups, like monks, were committed to non-violence, but this was considered a particular vocation rather than a general obligation. Catholic ideas about war were generally shaped by what is called just war theory, as formulated by Thomas Aquinas, whereby any war is immoral unless it satisfies certain moral criteria. It was possible on this basis to oppose particular wars. Almost all wars that actually occurred, in fact, could be credibly opposed, but it couldn't be used to argue that war as such was intrinsically immoral. On the practical level, American bishops at the start of the 20th century tended to be militaristic, since American Catholics still at this point faced considerable discrimination, so there was a great pressure to be seen to be pro-American. So for these reasons, there were only 4 Catholics in the US recorded as conscientious objectors during the entire First World War. By the Second World War, however, Catholics made up a disproportionately large number of conscientious objectors. This was partly due to the formation in the 1930s of the Catholic Worker Movement, a left-wing group which took an absolutist pacifist position, which represented a new strand in Catholic thinking about war. They tried to establish continuity with what they identified as a tradition of Catholic nonviolence, putting a lot of emphasis on the biblical Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is recorded as saying, "Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also," and on practitioners of nonviolence like St. Francis of Assisi in a medieval tradition of the Church. The Association of Catholic Conscientious Objectors emerged out of the Catholic Worker to provide legal representation for Catholic COs and assist with practical problems like a lack of infrastructure. Historic peace churches like the Quakers and the Mennonites funded labor camps for their COs to perform alternative service. The Catholic bishops who supported the war wouldn't fund a Catholic one, so the ACCO arranged funding from those churches for a Catholic alternative service camp. Pacifism remained very much on the fringes of the Church, but there was now a small infrastructure of advocacy groups and an intellectual tradition behind it. The Vietnam War saw a huge growth in the American anti-war movement. American Catholic bishops, on the other hand, overwhelmingly supported the war until quite late on, partly because of their continued insecurity about their Americanness, and partly because they saw it as a war against communism, and they exerted huge pressure on priests, so the Catholic anti-war movement as it existed was composed almost entirely of lay people. The ACCO continued to advocate for Catholic conscientious objectors, but at this point another group emerged out of Catholic worker communities, the Catholic Peace Fellowship. The CPF was more radical and politicized. Its members tended to be pacifists, but they generally based their campaigning on the Vietnam War not meeting the standard of the just war theory which most Catholics already accepted. The CPF also undertook direct action. They were among the first to publicly burn draft cards and raid draft offices where they destroy documents by pouring blood on them, which were extensively imitated by secular activists. Moon emphasizes that these actions emerged out of a specifically Catholic tradition of public ritual, which made them particularly significant in a way that was recognizable even for non-Catholic spectators. Due in large part to the CPF's lobbying, by the 1970s Catholic bishops themselves opposed the war, and the Vatican for the first time published a document legitimizing Catholic conscientious objection. The American Church began to support peace education initiatives, and these pacifist initiatives, which were now mainstream, still tended to be led by lay people. Meanwhile, more radical Catholic anti-war organizations like the Catholic Worker, the CPF, and the Anti-Nuclear Plowshares movement generally avoided the big drop in membership that most anti-war organizations experienced after the Vietnam War ended. Covis argues that this is primarily because their pacifist activities were part of broader programs. Most of them performed anti-poverty work as well, and their principles are grounded in a broader moral system. The Catholic pacifist movement is, I think, worth thinking about, because it has managed to have a disproportionately large influence given its size, and because it represents an unusual case of a significant anti-war movement emerging within a few decades from almost nothing. You can read more about it in these articles, which will be uploaded to the Library of Peace, and some related material which I'll upload to the Museum of Peace concerning the Ploughshares movement and the Pope's recent pilgrimage of peace to the DRC in South Sudan.